Hey guys, tonight we begin with something darker. A story about ambition so ruthless it devoured its own children. About a family that turned daughters into currency and sons into collateral damage. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In 1536, a brother and sister were executed within days of each other, both accused of treason, both accused of adultery, and both accused of something so vile, so unthinkable, that even hardened Tudor courtiers whispered about it in horror. Incest. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, and his sister Anne, Queen of England, were accused of having sexual relations with each other, of conceiving deformed children together, of plotting to murder the king so they could rule as lovers. It was grotesque, scandalous, utterly unprovable. And it worked. But here's what they don't teach you in history class. The Boleyns didn't fall because of Anne's ambition. They fell because of their fathers. Thomas Boleyn had spent decades building a dynasty on the backs of his children. He'd pimped out his daughters to kings, traded his sons' loyalty for titles and land, built a fortune on the premise that his children were commodities to be used, traded and discarded when they stopped being profitable. And when the machinery he'd built turned against them, when his son was arrested, his daughter beheaded, and his family name destroyed, Thomas Boleyn did what ambitious men always do. He survived. Tonight, we're pulling apart the Boleyn family secret. Not the incest, that was theatre, a convenient lie to destroy them. The real secret was worse. It was the systematic sacrifice of 3 children by a father who saw them as investments, who understood that power required blood, and who was willing to spill his own children's blood to get it. This isn't a story about Anne Boleyn's ambition. It's a story about what happens when a family treats its members like pawns, when daughters are leverage and sons are expendable, when love takes a backseat to advancement and every relationship is a transaction. So settle in. This is going to take a while. Because the Boleyn story isn't just about a queen who lost her head. It's about a sister who was used and discarded, a brother who died screaming his innocence, and a father who walked away from it all with his titles intact and his conscience unbothered. Let's start where all good horror stories start, with a man who saw an opportunity and decided his children were the price worth paying. Thomas Boleyn wasn't born powerful. That's important to understand. He wasn't one of those ancient noble families with bloodlines stretching back to William the High, Conqueror. He was minor gentry, ambitious, clever, and utterly ruthless. Born around 1477, Thomas understood something crucial about Tudor England. Power didn't flow from land anymore. It flowed from proximity to the king. If you could get close to Henry VIII and later his son, Henry VIII, you could build a fortune, get offices, get estates, get influence. But how do you get close to a king when you're nobody? You offer him something he wants. Thomas Boleyn's first calculated move was his marriage. He married Elizabeth Howard, daughter of the Duke of Norfolk. This wasn't love, this was strategy. The Howards were old nobility, powerful, connected. Marrying Elizabeth gave Thomas access to networks he could never have reached on his own. They had 3 children that survived infancy. Mary, born around 1499, Anne, born around 1501 or 1507, the records are fuzzy, and George, born around 1504. 3 children, 3 investments, 3 tools Thomas would use to climb. Thomas was intelligent, educated, and spoke multiple languages fluently. French, Latin, Italian. He was exactly the kind of man Henry VIII liked to keep around. Cultured but not threatening, useful but not too powerful, and Henry rewarded him, sent him on diplomatic missions, gave him minor offices, let him attend court. But minor offices weren't enough for Thomas Boleyn. He wanted more: estates, titles, real power, and he had 3 perfectly good children who could help him get it. Here's where the story gets dark, because Thomas Boleyn looked at his daughters, Mary and Anne, and saw opportunities, not children, not people with their own dreams and futures, but leverage. In Tudor England, a beautiful, charming, educated daughter was a commodity. You could marry her off to secure an alliance, or if you were really ambitious, you could present her to the king, let her become a mistress, and if she played her cards right, if she kept the king interested, the rewards for her family could be enormous. Titles, land, offices, influence, all flowing to the father of the king's mistress. Thomas Boleyn understood this game better than most, and he had 2 daughters to play with, so he invested in them, heavily. He sent Mary to the French court as a young teenager, around 13 or 14 years old, to serve as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Mary Tudor. This wasn't kindness, this was training. The French court was famous for its sophistication, its culture, and its sexual intrigue. A young girl sent there learned how to charm, how to flirt, how to navigate the dangerous waters of royal favour. And if she also learned how to use her body as currency, well, that was part of the education. Mary Boleyn learned fast. When she returned to England in 1519, she was around 20 years old, beautiful, charming, sophisticated, exactly the kind of woman who caught King Henry VIII's eye, and her father made sure Henry noticed. We need to talk about what this meant, what Thomas Boleyn was actually doing. He was presenting his daughter, his own child, to the king as a potential sexual partner. He was pimping her out, politely, in a way that looked like courtly favour and royal service. But strip away the fancy language, and that's what it was. Thomas Boleyn was trading his daughter's body for political advantage. And Mary, she didn't really have a choice. In Tudor England, you didn't say no to the king. You definitely didn't say no to your father. Especially not when your father had spent years preparing you for exactly this moment. So when Henry VIII looked at Mary Boleyn with interest, when he smiled at her across a crowded room, when he sent her gifts and invitations, Mary did what she'd been trained to do. She said yes, and Thomas Boleyn started collecting his rewards. The affair between Henry VIII and Mary Boleyn probably started around 1520, maybe earlier. The records are deliberately vague because royal mistresses existed in a legal grey area. Everyone knew about them. No one talked about them openly. Henry was married to Catherine of Aragon at the time. Catherine, the Spanish princess, deeply religious, 6 years older than Henry, and after nearly 15 years of marriage, she'd given him one surviving child, a daughter, Mary. Henry wanted a son, desperately. He was a king. Kings needed male heirs. Without a son, his dynasty was vulnerable. And Catherine, now in her mid-30s, was unlikely to have more children. So Henry did what kings did. He took mistresses, and Mary Boleyn was young, beautiful, and willing. Or at least, she appeared willing. Who knows what she actually felt? Fear, probably. Pressure. The weight of her father's expectations. But she smiled. She charmed. She let Henry into her bed, and for a while, everyone benefited. Thomas Boleyn got offices, got land, got honours. He was made treasurer of the king's household, a lucrative position. He was sent on prestigious diplomatic missions. He was given grants and properties, all because his daughter was keeping the king happy. The Howard family, Mary's mother's family, also benefited. Suddenly they had even more influence at court. The Duke of Norfolk, Mary's uncle, was one of the most powerful men in England, and now his family was even more entrenched. And Mary, what did Mary get? Gifts, probably, jewellery, nice dresses, the prestige of being noticed by the king, and a reputation. Because being the king's mistress came with social consequences. You were simultaneously envied and scorned, powerful and vulnerable. One wrong move and you could be discarded, replaced, forgotten. Mary was married to William Carey in February 1520, a minor nobleman, handsome, young, completely unthreatening. The marriage was almost certainly arranged by Thomas Boleyn as cover for Mary's affair with the king, because while everyone knew about royal mistresses, appearances still mattered. A married woman having an affair with the king was more acceptable than an unmarried one. William Carey got titles and grants for his cooperation, for being the complacent husband, for pretending not to notice that his wife was sleeping with the king. He became a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, got lucrative positions, got money. Everyone was profiting from Mary's body, except Mary. The affair lasted several years. Some historians think it lasted until 1525 or 1596. During that time, Mary had 2 children. Catherine, born in 1524, Henry, born in 1526. Were they the king's children? Maybe. Probably, in the case of young Henry. King Henry VIII never officially acknowledged them as his, but he'd acknowledged his illegitimate son by Bessie Blount, Henry Fitzroy. The fact that he didn't acknowledge Mary's children suggests either he wasn't sure they were his or he just didn't care enough. Mary Boleyn had given the king years of her life, had borne him children, had let herself be used by her family, by the court, by the system. And what did she get for it? Nothing. No titles, no lands in her own name, no acknowledgement, no security. Just a fading memory of royal favour and 2 children whose paternity would be whispered about for centuries. And then Henry got bored. He started looking elsewhere, started noticing other women, and Mary, now in her mid-20s with 2 young children and a complacent but ultimately powerless husband, was discarded. Not dramatically, not with scandal, just set aside, replaced, forgotten. The king stopped visiting, stopped sending gifts, stopped noticing her, and when the king stops noticing you, everyone else stops noticing you too. Mary Boleyn became a footnote, the king's former mistress, yesterday's news. Her value to her family had expired. She'd served her purpose, generated wealth and influence for her father and uncle, and now she was done. Thomas Boleyn barely looked at her. He had another daughter, a younger one. Smarter, maybe, more ambitious, more interesting. Anne. And Anne had been watching everything. Watching her older sister be used. Watching her be discarded. Watching how their father had treated Mary like a commodity. Traded her body for influence, and then moved on when she stopped being useful. Anne learned a lesson from her sister's fate, and it was a simple one. Never be the mistress, be the wife, or be nothing at all. Anne Boleyn returned to England from France in 1522. She'd spent years at the French court, longer than Mary, and she'd learned different lessons. Anne was sharp, witty, educated. She could speak French fluently, could dance, could play music, could debate religion and politics. She wasn't conventionally beautiful, not like Mary. Contemporary descriptions call her striking rather than pretty. Dark eyes, dark hair, a long neck, an extra fingernail on one hand that people would later call a witch's mark. But Anne had something more valuable than beauty. She had presence, charisma, the ability to command attention when she walked into a room. And she was smart enough to know how to use it. When she arrived at court, she caught attention immediately. Not just from the king, not yet, but from nobles, from other courtiers, from men who saw her intelligence and wit and found it attractive. One of those men was Henry Percy, son and heir to the Earl of Northumberland. Young, wealthy, titled, and completely infatuated with Anne Boleyn. They began a courtship, maybe even got secretly betrothed. It's unclear, but they were serious enough that people noticed. And when people noticed, Cardinal Wolsey stepped in. Wolsey was Henry VIII's chief minister at the time, the most powerful man in England after the king, and he had other plans for Henry Percy, plans that didn't include marrying a Boleyn girl, no matter how charming she was. Wolsey broke up the relationship, publicly, humiliatingly. He hauled Henry Percy in front of him and berated him for making promises to a girl beneath his station, reminded him of his duties to his family, to his title, and forced him to marry someone else. Anne was furious, publicly humiliated. She'd been courted by one of the richest heirs in England, and then dumped because a cardinal decided she wasn't good enough. She blamed Wolsey, hated him with a passion that would last for years, and she filed away a lesson. Power mattered, titles mattered, and until you had them, you were vulnerable. But something else happened during the Percy debacle, something that would change everything. King Henry VIII noticed Anne Boleyn, and not in a casual way. He noticed her. At first, Anne treated him the same way she treated every man at court: charm, wit, flirtation. But no more. She'd learned from watching Mary. She knew exactly what happened to women who became royal mistresses: used, discarded, forgotten. So when Henry VIII made it clear he was interested, when he started pursuing her, sending her gifts, writing her letters, Anne did something no one expected. She said no, not rudely, not dramatically, but firmly. She would not be his mistress. She would not follow in her sister's footsteps. She would not give him her body without marriage, without security, without power. Henry was shocked. He was the king. Women didn't say no to him. They competed for his attention. They threw themselves at him. And here was Anne Boleyn, a nobody from a minor family, refusing him. It drove him insane. He wanted her more, pursued her harder, wrote her passionate letters, begging for her favour, sent her increasingly expensive gifts. And Anne kept refusing. She was playing a dangerous game, the most dangerous game possible. Because if she miscalculated, if Henry's interest waned before she secured her position, she'd end up with nothing. Worse than nothing. She'd be known as the woman who refused the king, ruined, unmarriageable, destroyed. But Anne understood something about Henry VIII that most people didn't. He was a romantic. He loved the chase, the pursuit, the idea of courtly love, where the knight pines for the unattainable lady. Anne gave him that fantasy. Let him play the suffering lover. Let him write poetry and letters and grand declarations. And she kept saying no for years. This wasn't just about attraction anymore. Henry was obsessed. He'd never wanted anything he couldn't have. And Anne Boleyn was standing between him and satisfaction. She became an obsession, a fixation, the thing he thought about constantly. By 1527, Henry had made a decision. He would divorce Catherine of Aragon. He would marry Anne Boleyn, and he would make her Queen of England. Not his mistress, his wife, his queen, the mother of his legitimate sons, the woman who would secure his dynasty. This wasn't what Thomas Boleyn had planned. When he'd sent Mary to the king, he'd expected a mistress arrangement. Money and influence for the family. Not this. Not a complete upheaval of English politics. Not a break with the Catholic Church. Not his daughter wearing a crown. But Anne had outplayed him, had taken the opportunity he'd created and turned it into something far bigger, far more dangerous, and far more powerful. Thomas Boleyn probably couldn't believe his luck. His younger daughter wasn't going to be a mistress. She was going to be queen. The rewards for his family would be astronomical. Titles, lands, offices, power beyond anything he'd imagined. All he had to do was help Henry get his divorce. And that's where things got complicated. Because in 1527, divorcing Catherine of Aragon wasn't just a personal matter. It was international politics. It was religion. It was a diplomatic nightmare that would drag on for 6 years and split England from Rome. But Thomas Boleyn didn't care about the complications. He saw the prize, his daughter, the Queen. And he would do whatever it took to make it happen. Even if it meant destroying the English Church. Even if it meant making enemies of the most powerful rulers in Europe. Even if it meant putting his daughter in a position so precarious that one mistake could cost her everything. Thomas Boleyn saw the crown and reached for it, and he used his daughter's body to get there, again. The years between 1527 and 1533 were torture. For Anne, for Henry, for everyone involved. Henry wanted his divorce from Catherine of Aragon, needed it. He'd convinced himself that God was punishing him for marrying his brother's widow. That's why Catherine couldn't give him sons. That's why his dynasty was in danger. His marriage was cursed, illegitimate, wrong. If only the Pope would annul it, he could marry Anne, have legitimate sons, secure his throne. But Pope Clement VII wouldn't cooperate. Couldn't cooperate. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, the most powerful man in Europe. Charles controlled huge swaths of territory, including Rome itself at certain points. The Pope couldn't afford to anger him by declaring his aunt's marriage invalid, so Henry was stuck, married to a woman he didn't want, unable to marry the woman he was obsessed with, and growing more frustrated and desperate by the day. Anne, meanwhile, was in an impossible position. She'd refused to be Henry's mistress, but she also couldn't marry him because he was still married to someone else. She was suspended in limbo, not quite mistress, not quite wife, just waiting and waiting and waiting. For 6 years. Imagine being her. You're in your 20s. The King of England is obsessed with you. Everyone at court knows it. Some people envy you, others hate you. Catherine of Aragon's supporters blame you for everything. They call you the concubine, the whore. They say you've bewitched the king, used sorcery to steal him from his rightful wife. You can't back down now. You've gone too far. If you give up, if you give in and become Henry's mistress, you'll end up like your sister, used and discarded. But if you keep refusing, if the divorce never happens, you'll end up with nothing. Worse than nothing, a woman who wasted the best years of her life waiting for a marriage that never came. The pressure must have been unbearable, and through it all, Anne had to smile, had to be charming, had to keep Henry interested without giving him what he wanted, had to walk the tightrope between refusal and encouragement. One wrong step and she'd fall. Her father, Thomas Boleyn, was prospering during this time. Henry kept promoting him, made him Viscount Rochford in 1525, made him Earl of Wiltshire in 1529, gave him offices and estates, all on the promise that Anne would eventually be queen. Thomas Boleyn was collecting his payment in advance, betting that his daughter's gamble would pay off, and he pushed her, kept her focused, reminded her what was at stake. This was the family's chance, their shot at real power. She couldn't fail, couldn't weaken, couldn't give in. But Anne wasn't doing this for her father, not anymore. She was doing it for herself. She'd watched her sister be used. She'd watched her father trade his children like commodities. And she'd decided that if she was going to be used, she would at least get something real out of it. A crown, power, security, the ability to never be discarded again. But there was a problem. A growing, gnawing, inescapable problem. Henry was getting older. He was desperate for an heir, and Anne, by refusing to sleep with him, was gambling that his obsession would last long enough for the divorce to come through. What if it didn't? What if he got bored? What if he found someone else? Someone who would say yes? By 1532, Anne could feel time running out. Henry had broken with Rome, had declared himself supreme head of the Church of England, had given Cardinal Wolsey, Anne's old enemy, the boot and stripped him of power, had appointed Thomas Cranmer as Archbishop of Canterbury. Everything was in place. The divorce was inevitable, but it still hadn't happened yet. And Anne was now in her 30s, her best childbearing years slipping away. So sometime in late 1532, Anne made a decision. She slept with Henry. Finally. After more than 5 years of refusal. Was it strategic? Probably. Was it because she genuinely wanted him? Maybe. Or maybe she was just exhausted, tired of waiting, tired of the pressure, tired of gambling everything on a divorce that kept getting delayed. Whatever the reason, by January 1533, Anne was pregnant. And that changed everything, because a pregnant Anne Boleyn couldn't wait for the Pope's permission anymore. Henry needed to marry her immediately, before the pregnancy showed. before anyone could claim his child was illegitimate. So on January 25th, 1533, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn were married, in secret, in a small ceremony with barely any witnesses. It wasn't official yet. Catherine hadn't been formally divorced, but Henry didn't care about technicalities anymore. In May 1533, Archbishop Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon null and void, invalid. It had never been a real marriage, which meant Henry was free to marry Anne, which he already had. On June 1st, 1533, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England, walked through the streets of London in a massive coronation procession, wore a crown, sat on a throne, became one of the most powerful women in the country. Thomas Boleyn stood there watching his daughter crowned queen. Must have felt like vindication. Like all those years of scheming and strategizing had finally paid off. His daughter was queen. His family was secure. He was the father of the Queen of England, one of the most powerful men in the kingdom. But there was one small problem. Anne was 6 months pregnant, and everyone knew it. The coronation couldn't hide her belly. The whole country was watching, counting months, doing math, and everyone was wondering the same thing. Would Anne give Henry the son he needed? The legitimate male heir that would justify everything? The break with Rome, the divorce, the 6 years of waiting. Because if she didn't, if Anne gave birth to another girl, then Henry had destroyed his marriage, split from the Catholic Church, and made himself the most hated man in Europe for nothing. On September 7th, 1533, Anne Boleyn went into labour. Henry waited. The court waited. The entire country waited. This child would determine everything. The future of the dynasty, the future of the Reformation, the future of Anne herself. Anne laboured for hours, days probably. The records aren't clear. And finally, she gave birth to a girl. They named her Elizabeth. She was healthy, perfect, legitimate, a princess, Henry's legal heir, at least until he had a son. But she wasn't a son. Henry was devastated. Publicly, he said all the right things, celebrated the birth, assured everyone that sons would follow. But privately, he was furious, disappointed, and already wondering if he'd made a terrible mistake. Anne had one job: give him a son. That was the whole point, the reason for everything. And she'd failed. She'd given him a daughter. Just like Catherine had. Just like every other woman in his life had. And that's when Anne Boleyn's real nightmare began. Because now she was queen. But she was also vulnerable. She'd promised Henry a son, gambled everything on being able to deliver what Catherine couldn't. And instead, she'd given him the same thing, a daughter. The clock was ticking, and everyone knew it. Anne needed to get pregnant again, quickly. And this time, she needed to give birth to a boy. Because if she didn't, if she kept having girls or miscarriages, Henry would start looking for a way out. Thomas Boleyn knew it too. His position depended entirely on Anne's success, on her ability to give Henry what he wanted. If Anne fell, the whole Boleyn family would fall with her. The crown his daughter wore suddenly looked less like a prize and more like a noose. Anne got pregnant again quickly. By early 1534, she was expecting. This time, surely, it would be a boy. This time, God would grant them a son. But in the summer of 1534, Anne miscarried, lost the baby. The records are sparse, but it was almost certainly a boy. Or at least that's what people said. What Henry believed. Anne had lost Henry's son. Henry didn't rage, didn't shout. But something shifted. The obsession that had driven him for nearly a decade started to cool. He started noticing Anne's flaws, her sharp tongue, her temper, her tendency to argue with him. Things he'd found charming during the chase now irritated him. Anne, feeling the ground shift beneath her, panicked, started trying to control Henry's behaviour, started demanding he stop seeing other women, started confronting him about his flirtations, started behaving, in short, exactly like Catherine had. And Henry hated it. He hadn't torn apart English politics and split from Rome just to be nagged by another wife. By late 1534, Henry was already looking at other women, one in particular, Jane Seymour, a lady in waiting to Anne, quiet, demure, obedient, everything Anne wasn't. Anne saw what was happening, could feel Henry's interest drifting, could see courtiers starting to hedge their bets, starting to whisper, starting to wonder how long the Boleyn queen would last. She got pregnant again in 1535. This was it, her last chance. If this baby was a boy, she was saved. The dynasty was secured. Henry would love her again. Everything would be fine. But Anne was terrified. The pressure was crushing. Her position, completely dependent on something she couldn't control. Whether the child in her womb was male or female, whether she could carry it to term, whether she could deliver what Henry needed. In January 1536, everything collapsed. Catherine of Aragon died, and on the day of Catherine's funeral, the same day, Anne miscarried again, about 3.5 months into the pregnancy, and this time it was definitely a boy, or would have been, a male fetus, undeniable. Anne had lost Henry's son, again. Henry's reaction was cold, devastating. He visited her chamber. Anne looked at her lying there, bleeding and traumatized, and said something that chilled everyone who heard it. He said he now saw that God would not give him male children by her, that their marriage was cursed, just like his marriage to Catherine had been cursed. Anne must have felt her world ending in that moment, because Henry's words meant one thing. He'd already decided. This marriage was over. He wanted out, and now he was looking for a way to make it happen. But you couldn't just divorce a queen, especially not after you destroyed the English church to marry her in the first place. It would make Henry look foolish, weak, indecisive, would undermine everything he'd done. So Henry needed something else, not a divorce, something more permanent, something that would erase Anne completely, make it as if the marriage had never happened. He needed her dead, and he needed a good reason to kill her. Enter Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, the man who'd helped engineer the break with Rome, who'd helped Henry marry Anne in the first place, and who now saw which way the wind was blowing. Cromwell had a problem. Anne Boleyn hated him. They'd been on the same side once, both wanted the Reformation, both supported Protestant reforms, but they'd fallen out. Anne thought Cromwell wasn't moving fast enough. Cromwell thought Anne was reckless and interfered too much. More importantly, Cromwell saw that Henry wanted out, wanted Jane Seymour, wanted Anne gone, and Cromwell was always loyal to the king above everything else. So Cromwell started investigating, started asking questions, started looking for anything he could use against Anne, any indiscretion, any flirtation, any moment that could be twisted into something worse. He found gossip, whispers, nothing solid. Anne had always been flirtatious. That was part of her charm. She bantered with male courtiers, danced with them, joked with them, accepted their compliments. All perfectly normal for a queen holding court. But in Cromwell's hands, normal became sinister. Flirtation became seduction. Compliments became propositions. Dancing became adultery. Cromwell built a case out of nothing. Found men who'd been seen alone with Anne, who'd joked with her, who'd given her gifts or received gifts from her, who'd written her poetry or played music for her. 5 men: Francis Weston, Henry Norris, William Brereton, Mark Smeaton, a court musician, and George Boleyn, Anne's own brother. On April 30th, 1536, Mark Smeaton was arrested, tortured, and forced to confess. He admitted to adultery with the Queen. Whether it was true or whether he confessed to stop the pain, we'll never know. But once one confession existed, the machinery could move forward. On May 1st, 1536, during a joust at Greenwich, Henry stood up abruptly and left. Didn't say goodbye to Anne. Didn't explain. Just left. Rode to London with a small group of men and never saw his wife again. The next day, May 2nd, Anne was arrested, taken from Greenwich to the Tower of London, the same place she'd stayed before her coronation 3 years earlier, where she'd celebrated becoming queen. Now she was a prisoner, accused of adultery with 5 men, accused of plotting to murder the king, accused of treason, and accused of something even more devastating, incest with her own brother. George Boleyn, Viscount Rochford, was arrested on May 2nd, 1536, the same day as his sister. He was 31 years old, married to Jane Parker, a woman he apparently couldn't stand, no children, his entire life defined by being Anne Boleyn's brother. George had benefited enormously from Anne's rise. When Anne became queen, George became one of the most powerful men at court. Henry made him a gentleman of the Privy Chamber, sent him on diplomatic missions, gave him offices and honours, made him Viscount Rochford in 1529. George was intelligent, educated, charismatic, a skilled courtier. He spoke multiple languages, was well read, and was known for his wit. In many ways, he was the male version of Anne. Sharp, ambitious, dangerous when crossed. But George had a problem. He was too close to Anne. They'd always been close, grew up together, shared jokes, had the same quick minds and sharp tongues. They understood each other in a way siblings often do, and that closeness, in Thomas Cromwell's hands, became evidence of incest. The charge was specific, detailed, grotesque. George was accused of having sexual relations with Anne on multiple occasions, in October 1535, in November, in December. The dates were listed, the locations given. It was made to sound like an ongoing affair, a relationship of lust and treason. The accusation also claimed that Anne had told George she didn't believe Princess Mary was Henry's daughter, that they'd mocked the king's sexual abilities, that Anne had said she thought Henry was impotent, that they'd laughed about it together in private, like lovers would. It was all lies, made up, fabricated, but it didn't matter, because the accusation itself was enough. Once you're accused of incest, of something so vile and unnatural, your reputation is destroyed. Even if you're found innocent, the stain remains. George's wife, Jane Parker, was questioned, and according to some accounts, she gave testimony that was used against him. What exactly she said is unclear. The records are sparse, but later generations would accuse her of betraying her husband, of lying to destroy him. Whether that's true, or whether Jane herself was manipulated, threatened, or forced into giving testimony against her will, we'll never know. But the rumours stuck. Jane Parker, Lady Rochford, as the woman who helped kill her husband. George was taken to the Tower, questioned. But unlike Mark Smeaton, he wasn't tortured. He was nobility. You didn't torture nobles unless absolutely necessary. So Cromwell relied on other evidence, witness testimony, circumstantial details, the confession from Smeaton, and the incest charge, the nuclear weapon, the accusation so horrifying that even the whisper of it was enough to destroy someone. Because incest wasn't just a crime, it was a sin, an abomination, the worst thing you could accuse someone of. It suggested moral corruption so deep, so twisted, that the person was beyond redemption, beyond mercy, beyond humanity. And once you were accused of it, there was no defence. How do you prove you didn't have sex with your sibling? You can deny it, proclaim your innocence, call witnesses to testify to your character, but you can't prove a negative. You can't prove something didn't happen. That's the genius of the accusation. It's impossible to disprove. And even the accusation alone plants doubt, makes people wonder, makes them look at you differently. George understood what was happening. He knew the trial was a formality, a show. The verdict had already been decided. Henry wanted Anne gone, and George, as Anne's closest male relative and supporter, had to go too. You couldn't leave a Boleyn man alive who might seek revenge, who might become a figurehead for opposition. So George was going to die, not because he'd done anything wrong, but because he was Anne Boleyn's brother, because he was in the way. On May 12, 1536, the 4 accused men, Norris, Weston, Brereton and Smeaton, were tried for adultery and treason. All found guilty, all sentenced to death. On May 15, 1536, Anne and George were tried separately. Anne went first. 26 peers sat in judgment of her. Her uncle, the Duke of Norfolk, presided. Imagine that. Your uncle sitting there, condemning you to death. Knowing you're innocent, not caring. Anne defended herself brilliantly, calmly denied every charge, pointed out the absurdity of the accusations, called witnesses, but it didn't matter. The verdict was already decided. Guilty, sentenced to death by burning or beheading at the king's pleasure. Then it was George's turn. He was tried on the charge of adultery with the Queen and treason. His own father, Thomas Boleyn, sat among the judges. Imagine that too, your father, sitting there, watching you be condemned to death, doing nothing. George defended himself forcefully, denied every charge, called the accusations lies and fabrications. At one point during the trial, he was handed a piece of paper and told not to read it aloud. It contained allegations that Anne had said Henry was impotent. The prosecution didn't want him to read it publicly because even mentioning the king's sexual inadequacy was dangerous. George, knowing he was doomed anyway, read it aloud. Repeated Anne's alleged words. Let the court and the world know what had been said. It was a final act of defiance, a middle finger to the system destroying him. If I'm going to die, George seemed to be saying, I'm at least going to make you uncomfortable. The jury deliberated briefly, returned with the inevitable verdict, guilty. George Boleyn was sentenced to be hanged, drawn and quartered. The traitor's death. The most agonising execution the Tudor state could devise. George was taken back to his cell, to wait, to think about what was coming, to wonder if his father would lift a finger to save him. Thomas Boleyn did nothing, said nothing, made no appeals, raised no objections, just sat there in the trial and watched his son be condemned to death, and then when it was over, went home. Still Earl of Wiltshire, still holding his offices, still protected, still alive, because Thomas Boleyn had made a calculation. His children were expendable, his position was not. Anne spent her final days in the Tower of London, the same apartment she'd stayed in before her coronation, where she'd been pampered and celebrated and prepared to become queen. Now she was a prisoner, guarded constantly, watched, listened to, everything she said reported back to Cromwell. She veered between confidence and terror. At times she seemed certain she'd be saved, that Henry would come to his senses, that this was all a mistake. Other times she broke down, laughed hysterically, wept, made dark jokes about her own execution. At one point she said she'd heard the executioner was very good, that he'd use a sword instead of an axe. She put her hands around her slender neck and laughed. I heard say the executioner was very good, and I have a little neck. It's a haunting image. A woman joking about her own beheading, trying to maintain some dignity, some control, in a situation where she had none. George was in a different part of the tower, separate from his sister. But they must have known, must have been aware that the other was nearby, going through the same terror, the same inevitability. On May 17th, 1536, Henry VIII made a small act of mercy. He commuted George's sentence from hanging, drawing and quartering to simple beheading. Nobility got the privilege of a quick death. George would die like a nobleman, not like a traitor. Small comfort, but at least it meant less pain, less public spectacle, less degradation. That same day, Archbishop Cranmer declared Henry's marriage to Anne null and void, invalid from the beginning, which meant Elizabeth, their daughter, was now illegitimate, a bastard, just like Henry's daughter with Catherine of Aragon. Think about that for a moment. Henry had Anne convicted of adultery and treason, but he also had their marriage annulled, which meant, legally, they'd never been married, which meant Anne couldn't have committed adultery because you can't commit adultery against someone you were never married to. It was logically inconsistent. Legally absurd, but Henry didn't care about logic. He cared about results. He wanted Anne dead. He wanted Jane Seymour. He wanted to erase the Boleyn marriage completely. And so he did. Laws and logic be damned. On the morning of May 17th, 1536, George Boleyn was taken from his cell to Tower Hill, the public execution ground just outside the Tower walls. A crowd had gathered. Executions were entertainment, spectacle. People came to watch. George mounted the scaffold, made a final speech. As was custom, he praised the king, admitted his sins. Not the sins he'd been accused of, not adultery, not incest, but general sins, pride, ambition, living a life focused on pleasure and advancement instead of God. He warned the crowd to learn from his fate, to live righteously, to trust in God. Standard execution speech stuff. You didn't proclaim your innocence at the scaffold. You didn't rage against the king. You accepted your fate with dignity, praised Henry, admitted you deserved death, because if you didn't, your family would suffer. Your property would be confiscated. Your name would be erased. So George did what was expected, spoke calmly, knelt down, put his head on the block. The executioner raised the axe, and with one stroke, George Boleyn was dead. 31 years old, killed because his sister had been queen. His body was taken away, buried quickly, quietly. No ceremony, no monument, just a grave somewhere in the Tower grounds. Within hours, his name was being erased, his titles confiscated, his property seized, as if he'd never existed, as if the Viscount Rochford had been a dream, a mistake, a stain to be wiped away. And 2 days later, on May 19th, 1536, Anne followed him to the scaffold. Anne Boleyn was executed on the morning of May 19th, 1536, on Tower Green, inside the Tower walls, a private execution, reserved for royalty. Even in death, she got the privilege of not being gawked at by common crowds. Henry had shown one small mercy. He'd imported a swordsman from France, a skilled executioner, fast, clean, better than the usual English axe, which often required multiple strikes. Anne dressed carefully that morning, a grey damask gown, an ermine cape, her hair tucked up under a coif. She looked like a queen, walked like a queen, mounted the scaffold with dignity. She made a short speech. Like George, she didn't proclaim innocence, didn't rage, just praised the king, said he'd been a good and gentle sovereign to her, committed her soul to God, asked the small crowd to pray for her. She removed her cape, removed her headdress, knelt down. Her ladies tied a blindfold around her eyes. Anne kept praying, "To Jesus Christ I commend my soul. Lord Jesus, receive my soul." The swordsman moved silently. Anne never saw the blow coming. One clean strike, her head was severed. Anne Boleyn, Queen of England, was dead. 35 years old, 3 years a queen, killed on fabricated charges because she couldn't give Henry a son. Her body and head were placed in an elm arrow chest. No coffin had been prepared, and buried in an unmarked grave in the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula inside the tower. No ceremony, no prayers, no monument, just dumped in a box and buried like a criminal. Henry VIII married Jane Seymour 11 days later. 11 days, didn't even wait a respectable mourning period. Just married the woman he'd already chosen while Anne was still alive. And the Boleyn family? Where were they during all this? Where was Thomas Boleyn, the Earl of Wiltshire, the father of the executed Queen and Lord? He was at court, living quietly, keeping his head down, saying nothing, doing nothing, accepting that his 2 children were dead and his family name was destroyed. But at least he was alive. At least he still had his titles. At least he hadn't been dragged down with them. Thomas Boleyn had sacrificed his children, both of them, watched them be executed, and then went back to his estates and continued living his life as if nothing had happened. Mary Boleyn, watching all this from the sidelines, must have felt vindicated, horrified, traumatised, But vindicated, she'd been discarded, forgotten, treated like she didn't matter, and she'd hated it, resented her father, resented Anne for succeeding where she'd failed. But Mary was alive. Her children were alive. She'd escaped the machinery that had destroyed her siblings. And maybe, just maybe, being forgotten wasn't the worst thing that could happen to you. Because Anne had been queen. George had been Viscount Rochford. They'd had power, titles, influence, everything their father wanted for them. And it had gotten them killed. Mary had been nothing. A footnote. The king's former mistress. Yesterday's news. And that obscurity had saved her life. Mary Boleyn didn't attend her siblings' executions. She wasn't at court, wasn't in London. She was living quietly in the countryside, probably at Rochford Hall in Essex, one of the family properties, staying out of sight, out of mind. Her husband, William Carey, had died in 1528, sweating sickness, one of those sudden plague-like illnesses that swept through England periodically. He'd been 32. Left Mary a widow, with 2 young children and very little money. Anne, as queen, had helped her, given her some support, some small grants, but not much. Their relationship had been strained. Mary had married again in 1534, in secret, to a man named William Stafford. William Stafford was a soldier, minor gentry, no money, no title, no prospects. Exactly the kind of man you weren't supposed to marry if you were a Boleyn, if you were the sister of the Queen. Anne was furious when she found out, cut Mary off, banished her from court, called it a disgraceful match. How dare Mary marry so far beneath herself? How dare she embarrass the family? The irony was thick. Thomas Boleyn had literally pimped out Mary to the king, used her body as currency, discarded her when she was no longer profitable. And now, when Mary finally chose a man for herself, married for love, probably for the first time in her life, the family was outraged. But Mary didn't care anymore. She was done with the Boleyns, done with court, done with ambition. She'd watched her family use her, watched them discard her, and now she was watching them destroy themselves from a distance. When Anne fell in 1536, Mary was probably terrified. Her sister and brother were being executed for treason. That kind of taint spread, infected the whole family. Mary could easily have been dragged into the investigation, questioned, accused. After all, she'd been the king's mistress too. What if Cromwell decided to go after her? To finish destroying the Boleyns completely? But Cromwell didn't bother. Mary wasn't important enough. She had no power, no influence, no danger. She was just the sister, the forgotten one, the one who'd already been discarded years ago. So Mary survived, and not just survived, she lived the rest of her life in relative peace, with her husband William Stafford, with her children, quietly, anonymously, exactly the way she wanted. She wrote one letter that survives from this period, written to Thomas Cromwell in 1534, begging for his help, explaining that she'd married for love, that she was poor, that her family had abandoned her. The tone is humble, desperate, sad. I had rather beg my bread with him than to be the greatest queen in Christendom. It's a remarkable line. Mary Boleyn, sister of the Queen, saying she'd rather be poor with a man she loved than have power and wealth. It was a rejection of everything her family stood for, everything her father had taught her, everything Anne had fought for. Mary had learned a different lesson than Anne. Anne thought power was safety, that being queen would protect her, that titles and influence and control were the answer. Mary knew better. She'd seen what happened to powerful women, to women who reached too high, to women who got too close to the king. They were used, discarded, destroyed. Better to be nobody, better to be forgotten, better to be invisible, because invisible women survived. When Anne and George were executed in 1536, Mary probably grieved. They were her siblings, her family, people she'd grown up with, loved, resented. but probably still loved. You don't just stop caring about people because they've hurt you. But she also probably felt relief, guilt-inducing, shameful relief. She was alive. Her children were alive. She'd escaped, and maybe part of her felt vindicated, justified in her choices. She'd refused to play the game, had married a nobody, had been banished from court, and that disgrace had saved her life. Mary Boleyn lived another decade, died around 1543. The records are sparse. She wasn't important enough for detailed documentation. No grand funeral, no monument, just another woman who'd lived and died in Tudor England. Her children survived. Catherine and Henry Carey both thrived. Catherine became a lady-in-waiting to Anne of Cleves, and later to Queen Elizabeth II. Yes, Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the girl who'd been declared illegitimate after her mother's execution. Catherine lived into her 80s, died wealthy and respected. Henry Carey became Baron Hunsdon, served Elizabeth I faithfully, was possibly her half-brother if the rumours about his paternity were true. Elizabeth certainly treated him like family, gave him honours and responsibilities, trusted him. So Mary's children did fine, better than fine. They survived the Boleyn taint, built their own lives, their own reputations, separate from the disaster that had destroyed their aunt and uncle. And Mary, she was forgotten, erased from history for centuries. When people talked about the Boleyns, they talked about Anne, the Queen, the woman who'd captivated Henry VIII and split the English Church, the one who'd been executed. They talked about George occasionally, the brother who'd died with her, the incest charge that had made the case even more scandalous. But Mary was a footnote. Anne Boleyn's sister, former mistress to Henry VIII, married some nobody and lived quietly. That's how history remembered her, as a minor character in someone else's story, and maybe that's exactly what Mary wanted, to be forgotten, to not matter, to fade into the background, where the machinery of power and ambition couldn't reach her. Because the Boleyns who mattered, who had power, who had titles, who had the king's attention, they all died. Used up, destroyed, discarded. The only Boleyn who survived was the one nobody cared about, the one who'd failed at being important, who'd married for love instead of advancement, who'd chosen obscurity over power. Mary Boleyn was the smart one, the survivor, the one who learned the real lesson of Tudor politics. Don't matter. Don't be important. Don't get close to power, because power destroys everyone who touches it. And the Boleyn family was proof. Thomas Boleyn outlived both his executed children, kept his titles, kept his properties, kept his life. After Anne and George were killed in May 1536, Thomas stayed at court for a little while, attended council meetings, performed his duties, acted like nothing had happened, but his power was gone, completely evaporated. He'd been powerful because his daughter was queen. Now his daughter was a traitor, an adulteress, a woman so vile she'd supposedly slept with her own brother. That kind of taint doesn't wash off. Within a year, Thomas had retired from court, withdrew to his estates, spent his final years in obscurity, probably alone. His wife Elizabeth had died in 1538. His son was dead. His daughter Anne was dead. Mary wanted nothing to do with him. He lived 3 more years, died in March 1539, around 62 years old. Natural causes, buried at Hever Church in Kent. He got a nice tomb, a brass plaque, nothing grand but respectable, more than his children got. The plaque mentioned his titles, his service to the crown, his diplomatic achievements. It didn't mention Anne, didn't mention George, didn't mention that he'd been the father of a queen, that his children had been executed for treason. Just his own accomplishments, as if Anne and George had never existed. Thomas Boleyn's legacy is complicated. On one hand, he was brilliant, skilled diplomat, intelligent, spoke multiple languages, rose from minor gentry to Earl of Wiltshire through ability and cunning. In a different context, he'd be admirable, a self-made man, proof that talent and ambition could overcome birth. But he got there by using his children, by treating them like commodities, by pimping out his daughters and sacrificing his son. And when the machinery he'd built turned against them, he did nothing, didn't defend them, didn't fight for them, didn't even speak up, just watched them die and then went home. Was he a monster or just a product of his time? In Tudor England, children were expected to serve their families. Marriages were arranged for political advantage. Daughters were used to secure alliances. This was normal, expected, the way things worked. But even by Tudor standards, Thomas Boleyn was cold. Most fathers would have at least protested, would have begged the king for mercy, would have offered themselves in their children's place, would have done something. Thomas did nothing, and that silence is damning. It suggests that to the very end, Thomas Boleyn saw his children not as people, but as investments. And when investments fail, you cut your losses. You don't throw good money after bad. You certainly don't sacrifice yourself for them. Anne and George were bad investments. They'd failed. They'd cost the family its reputation. The only rational thing to do was distance himself, preserve what he could, survive, and he did survive, died peacefully in his bed. Unlike his children, who died screaming on scaffolds, unlike his daughter Mary, who died in poverty and obscurity, Thomas Boleyn died with his titles intact, with property, with money. He won in a way, if winning means surviving, if winning means keeping what you have, if winning means never having to answer for what you did to your children. But his name is poison. History remembers Thomas Boleyn as the father who sacrificed his children for power, who pimped out his daughters, who sat silently while his son was executed, who chose survival over family. Whether he deserves that reputation, or whether he was just a man of his time doing what was expected, I'll let you decide. But the facts are clear. Thomas Boleyn used his children, and when they failed him, he discarded them, just like he'd taught them to do to others. The Boleyn family didn't just fall, it was erased, systematically destroyed. Within weeks of Anne and George's executions, the family name was tainted, toxic, associated with treason, adultery, and incest. Nobody wanted to be connected to the Boleyns. Former friends distanced themselves. Allies found other patrons. The family's properties were confiscated or redistributed. Their titles meant nothing. Their name was a curse. Mary survived by being nobody, by having married a man with no connections, by living in obscurity. The Carey children survived by not using the Boleyn name, by being identified with their father's family, by quietly existing on the periphery. But Anne's daughter, Elizabeth, couldn't hide. She was the king's daughter, illegitimate now, but still royal, still important, still a problem. Henry didn't know what to do with her. She reminded him of Anne, had Anne's dark eyes, Anne's intelligence, Anne's quick wit, everything that had once captivated him and now disgusted him. So Elizabeth was sent away, raised by others, given a household but little affection, declared illegitimate, removed from the succession, made into a footnote, a problem to be dealt with later. She was 3 years old when her mother was executed, probably didn't understand what was happening, just knew that suddenly everything changed. The Queen's daughter one day, nobody the next, Elizabeth grew up in that shadow, knowing her mother had been executed for treason and adultery, knowing people whispered about her, called her a bastard, questioned her legitimacy, suggested she carried her mother's taint, her mother's wickedness. Imagine growing up with that, knowing your mother was beheaded, that everyone thinks she was an adulteress, that your father killed her, that your very existence is controversial. Elizabeth learned the same lesson Mary had learned. Survival requires invisibility, requires being useful but not threatening, requires playing the game without seeming to play. She learned to be quiet, to be obedient, to avoid attention, to never ever mention her mother. Because mentioning Anne Boleyn was dangerous, even decades later. And yet Elizabeth survived, outlasted her father, outlasted her half-brother Edward VI, outlasted her half-sister Mary VIII. And in 1558 she became Queen Elizabeth VIII, the greatest monarch England would ever have, Anne Boleyn's daughter, the child born from the marriage that had torn apart the English church, the girl who'd been declared illegitimate, the bastard, the tainted one. She ruled for 45 years, never married, never gave anyone power over her, never let herself be used the way her mother had been used, learned from Anne's mistakes, from Mary Boleyn's obscurity, from George's destruction. Elizabeth understood what her mother hadn't. Power was safety, but only if you never ever gave it away, never depended on anyone, never trusted anyone, never loved anyone enough to be vulnerable. She became the Virgin Queen, married to England, untouchable, unbreakable, everything her mother had tried to be but couldn't quite achieve. And she never spoke about Anne, not publicly, not for the record. There are hints that privately, in her chambers, she kept a ring with Anne's portrait, that she thought about her mother, wondered about her, grieved for her perhaps, but publicly, silence, complete silence, because acknowledging Anne meant acknowledging the execution, the adultery charges, the incest, the taint. Better to be silent, better to let people forget, better to build your own legacy, separate from the horror that had destroyed your mother. Elizabeth succeeded where Anne failed, where George died, where Mary hid. She took the Boleyn ambition, the ruthless drive for power, and perfected it, used it without being destroyed by it, became untouchable, and in doing so, she vindicated her mother, proved that Anne's blood could produce greatness, that the Boleyn ambition, channeled correctly, could build an empire. But the cost, God, the cost. Elizabeth lived alone, never had children, never had a family, never let anyone close, spent her entire life building walls to keep people out, to keep herself safe, to avoid her mother's fate. She survived, thrived, became legend. But at what price? She'd learned her family's lesson too well. Trust no one, need no one, use everyone, and never, ever let yourself be vulnerable. The Boleyn curse didn't die with Anne and George. It transformed, became a lesson passed down, became the foundation of Elizabeth's reign, became the reason England's greatest queen never married, never loved, never trusted. Because the Boleyns who trusted, who loved, who depended on others, they all died, horribly, publicly, used and discarded by the very machinery they'd tried to control. Only the Boleyns who trusted no one survived, and even they didn't really live, they just endured. The incest accusation was never true. Let's be absolutely clear about that. There is zero evidence that Anne and George Boleyn had any kind of sexual relationship. None. Not a shred. Not a whisper of truth. It was pure fabrication. A legal nuclear weapon deployed by Thomas Cromwell to destroy Anne completely. Because adultery alone wasn't enough. You could maybe recover from adultery. Claim it was false. Have defenders argue your case, but incest destroyed everything. Your reputation, your name, your humanity. It was so vile, so unthinkable, that the accusation alone was enough to make people believe you were capable of anything. And that's why Cromwell used it, because he needed to make sure no one defended Anne. No one argued for her. No one suggested maybe the charges were exaggerated or false. The incest charge ensured silence, complicity, universal condemnation. Who would defend a woman accused of sleeping with her own brother? Who would risk being associated with that? Who would question the king's justice when the crime was so obviously, disgustingly evil? No one. That was the point. The incest charge isolated Anne completely, made her toxic, made defending her impossible. Even her own family stayed silent, because to defend her meant being associated with incest, with abomination, with evil. It was brilliant, in a horrible way. Cromwell understood human psychology, understood that people would rather believe a comfortable lie than an uncomfortable truth. And the comfortable lie was that Anne Boleyn was wicked, evil, unnatural, that her fall was justified, that the king was right to execute her. The uncomfortable truth? That Henry VIII was a tyrant who killed his wife because she couldn't give him a son. That the English legal system could be manipulated to destroy anyone the king wanted gone. That innocence meant nothing if the king decided you were guilty. People didn't want to think about that, so they believed the incest charge, whispered about it, embellished it, added details, made it worse with each retelling. Some accounts claimed Anne had given birth to deformed children because of the incest, that she'd miscarried monsters, that God had punished her with twisted, malformed fetuses as proof of her sin. None of it was true, but it didn't matter. The story had a life of its own, and for centuries, that story defined Anne Boleyn, the wicked queen, the adulteress, the woman who'd slept with 5 men, including her own brother, the seductress who'd destroyed the English church for her own ambition. Only in recent decades have historians started to dismantle this narrative, to point out that the evidence was non-existent, that the confessions were forced, that the entire trial was a show, that Anne and George were almost certainly innocent of every charge, but the stain remains. Even now, when you mention Anne Boleyn, people's first thought is often the one who was beheaded for adultery. The incest charge still whispers in the background, still colours how we see her, still makes people wonder if maybe there was some truth to it. That's the power of accusation, especially sexual accusation, especially something as taboo as incest. It never fully goes away. You can disprove it. You can show there was no evidence, but the doubt remains, the question mark, the wondering. And for Anne and George, that meant they died not just as traitors, but as monsters, as abominations, as people who'd committed crimes so vile that their executions were justified, necessary, even merciful compared to what they deserved. They died knowing that history would remember them not as victims of judicial murder, but as guilty, as wicked, as deserving of death. That's what the incest charge did. It made sure they couldn't be rehabilitated, couldn't be seen as martyrs, couldn't be anything except evil. And it worked. For 500 years, it worked. Only now are we starting to see past it, to recognise it for what it was. A lie, a weapon, a way to destroy 2 people completely. Not just their bodies, but their reputations, their legacy, their humanity. The Boleyn family's real secret wasn't incest. It was that they were destroyed by a system that needed scapegoats, that required blood sacrifice, that would rather believe comfortable lies than uncomfortable truths. And that system is still with us, still destroying people with accusations, still using sexual scandal to demolish reputations, still making it impossible to defend yourself once the accusation is made. The Boleyns were just early victims of something that continues today, the weaponization of scandal, the use of sexual accusation to destroy enemies, the understanding that you don't need proof, you just need the accusation, and people will believe it because it's easier, because it fits their prejudices, because the alternative is too uncomfortable. Anne and George Boleyn died 500 years ago, but the weapon that killed them is still being used, still destroying lives, still making it impossible to defend yourself against lies. That's the real horror of the Boleyn story. Not that they died, but that they died from a weapon we're still using, that we still don't know how to defend against, that we still pretend is about truth when it's really about power. So what's the real secret of the Boleyn family? What's the hidden truth behind the scandal and the executions and the horror? It's this: the Boleyns were destroyed not by their own ambition, but by a system that used them up and threw them away. They were tools, instruments, ways for powerful men, Thomas Boleyn, Henry VIII, Thomas Cromwell, to get what they wanted, Thomas wanted power, so he used his daughters, presented Mary to the king, trained Anne to be irresistible, encouraged their relationships, collected his rewards. And when it all fell apart, he stepped back, let them die, saved himself. Henry wanted a son, so he used Anne, pursued her, married her, broke with Rome for her, and when she couldn't deliver, he disposed of her, found a legal excuse, had her killed, married someone else 11 days later. Cromwell wanted to stay in power, so he built a case against Anne, arrested her allies, forced confessions, created charges out of nothing, destroyed an entire family to prove his loyalty to the king. And the Boleyn siblings, they were just caught in the machinery. Mary was used and discarded. Anne was elevated and destroyed. George was killed as collateral damage. None of them had real agency. None of them controlled their fates. They were pieces being moved by players who didn't care if they lived or died. That's the secret. That's the horror. Not that the Boleyns were wicked or ambitious or incestuous, but that they were used, systematically, by people who should have protected them, by systems designed to extract value from them and then discard them. Mary understood this early, learned her lesson after being the king's mistress, withdrew, married for love, chose obscurity, and survived. Anne never learned, kept thinking she could control the game, could manipulate the system, could use her intelligence and charm to build power, and it killed her. George didn't have a choice. He was a man in a family of women being used. His value was in supporting his sister. When she fell, he fell too, simple as that. And Thomas was the architect, the one who built the machine, who taught his children that their value came from their utility, from what they could provide, from how they could be used, and when the machine turned on them, he'd trained them so well that they didn't know how to escape, didn't even try. The Boleyn family wasn't destroyed by scandal. It was destroyed by the philosophy that created it, the belief that people are tools, that children are investments, that family loyalty comes second to personal survival. That power is worth any price. Thomas Boleyn believed all that, lived it, taught it, and when his children paid the price, he survived. Because he'd always known the game, had always been willing to sacrifice anyone, even his own blood, to keep playing. That's the secret. That's the horror. Not that the Boleyns were monsters, but that they were human, flawed, used, discarded. Just like countless other families throughout history who learned too late that power demands sacrifice, and the powerful never sacrifice themselves. So here's where we are, 500 years later, still talking about the Boleyns, still fascinated by their rise and fall, still trying to understand what happened. Anne Boleyn, the queen who wasn't supposed to be queen, who refused to be a mistress and demanded marriage, who changed England forever, who gave birth to Elizabeth I, who was executed on fabricated charges because she couldn't produce a son. George Boleyn, the brother who died alongside her, accused of incest, accused of treason, accused of crimes he almost certainly didn't commit, killed because he was in the way, because his sister's fall required his death too, because Boleyn men couldn't be allowed to survive. Mary Boleyn, the forgotten sister, the king's mistress, the one who was used first and discarded earliest, who married for love, who chose obscurity, who survived by being nobody, by not mattering. Thomas Boleyn, the father, the architect, the man who built a dynasty on his children's bodies, who pimped out his daughters, who sacrificed his son, who survived while they died, who kept his titles and properties and died peacefully in his bed. 4 people, 1 family, destroyed by ambition, by power, by a system that used them and discarded them, by a father who saw them as tools, by a king who saw them as obstacles, by a world that measured people's worth by their utility. The real tragedy of the Boleyn family isn't that they reached for power, it's that they were taught to measure their worth by their success in getting it, that they internalized the lesson that people are commodities, that family's a business arrangement, that love is weakness and trust is dangerous. Mary learned to reject that, chose love over power, obscurity over influence, survival over success, and she lived quietly, peacefully, with a man she chose, away from the machinery that had destroyed her siblings. Anne tried to master the system, to use the tools that had been used on her, to turn the game to her advantage, and she almost succeeded. Became queen, changed England, left a legacy that would reshape history. But the system destroyed her anyway, because the system always destroys women who get too powerful, who become too threatening, who forget their place. George never had a choice. His fate was tied to Anne's from the beginning. When she rose, he rose. When she fell, he fell. He was collateral damage in someone else's story, a footnote in his sister's tragedy. And Thomas got exactly what he wanted: power, titles, wealth. He just had to sacrifice his children to get it. And when history judges him, when we look back and see what he did, he's remembered not as a successful politician, but as a monster. A father who failed the most basic test of parenthood: protecting your children. The Boleyn story isn't unique. Versions of it play out constantly. Families who use their members, parents who see children as investments, systems that reward people for being ruthless and punish them for being human, power structures that demand sacrifice and extract it from those least able to refuse. What makes the Boleyn story compelling is that it's so well documented. We can see exactly how it happened, can trace the decisions, can watch the machinery engage, can see the moment when each person made their choice, to play the game or refuse it, to sacrifice or survive, to be noble or human. And we can learn from it, can see that power always costs, that ambition requires sacrifice, that the people who win are usually the ones willing to sacrifice others, and that the only way to escape the game is to refuse to play, to choose obscurity over power, to value survival over success. Mary Boleyn understood this, lived it, died forgotten but free. Anne never learned, kept playing until the game killed her. George never had a choice, and Thomas won by being the only one willing to sacrifice everyone else. That's the secret of the Boleyn family. Not incest, not witchcraft, not scandal, just the cold, brutal reality that power demands blood. And the powerful always make sure it's someone else's. Tonight we've walked through the horror of the Boleyn family, through the ambition that destroyed them, through the father who used them, through the sister who survived by being forgotten, through the queen who died for not producing a son, through the brother who died as collateral damage. We've seen how scandal is weaponized, how accusations work, how sexual charges destroy people even when they're false, how the stain remains long after the truth is revealed. We've watched a family torn apart, not by their own wickedness, but by a system that required sacrifice, that measured worth by utility, that used people up and discarded them, that rewarded ruthlessness and punished vulnerability. And we've seen the only survivor, Mary, the forgotten one, the nobody, the woman who learned that sometimes the only way to win is to stop playing, to choose love over power, to pick obscurity over influence, to value your life more than your legacy. The Boleyns didn't have a secret affair. They weren't monsters, they were just people, caught in a system designed to destroy them, used by people who should have protected them, sacrificed for goals they didn't choose. Anne Boleyn's real crime wasn't adultery, it was failing to produce a son. George's real crime wasn't incest, it was being Anne's brother. Mary's real crime wasn't being the king's mistress, it was being disposable. And Thomas's real crime wasn't ambition, it was being willing to sacrifice his children to feed it. That's the story, that's the horror, that's the secret. Not sex, not scandal, not sin, just power. and the price it demands, and the people who pay it, and the ones who survive by refusing to. So when you think about the Boleyns, don't think about the incest charges. Those were lies. Don't think about Anne's ambition. That was survival. Don't think about Mary's disgrace. That was liberation. Think about a family destroyed by the philosophy that people are commodities, that children are tools, that power is worth any price. Think about how that philosophy still exists, still destroys families, still demands sacrifice, still rewards the ruthless and punishes the human. Think about Thomas Boleyn living peacefully while his children died. And ask yourself what you'd do. Would you sacrifice others to survive? Would you use your family to advance? Would you watch your children die to keep your titles? Most of us want to say no, want to believe we'd be different, would be better, would choose family over power, would protect our children no matter the cost. But Thomas Boleyn probably thought that too, before the game started, before the opportunity appeared, before he realised how much power was within reach, how much he could gain, how far he could climb, if he was just willing to pay the price. And when the price came due, he paid it, with his children's lives, and then went home, and died peacefully, and history remembers him as a monster. The Boleyns weren't special, weren't unique, weren't even particularly unusual for their time. They were just a family playing the game of power, and like most families who play that game, they lost, except for the one member who refused to play, who chose obscurity, who valued survival over success. Mary Boleyn died forgotten, but she died free, and she died surrounded by people she loved, people she chose, people who didn't see her as a tool, as an investment, as a commodity, just as herself. And maybe that's worth more than a crown. Thanks for staying with me tonight. This was a long one, a dark one, a story about family and betrayal and the horrible things people do to each other in the name of advancement, about fathers who use their children, about siblings caught in machinery they didn't build, about the only survivor being the one nobody cared about. If you made it this far, drop a comment. Let me know what you think. What surprised you most about the Boleyn story? Had you known about Mary, about George, about Thomas's role in all of it? Let's talk about it. And if you want more stories like this, stories about families destroyed by ambition, about women used as commodities, about the real costs of power, subscribe, because history is full of these stories, full of people who learned too late that power demands sacrifice, and that the powerful never sacrifice themselves. Sleep well, or don't. Sometimes the truth is too disturbing for easy sleep. Sometimes you need to sit with it. Let it sink in. Let it change how you see power, how you see ambition, how you see the people around you who'd sacrifice anything to advance. The Boleyns are gone, but the game continues. The machinery still runs, still uses people, still discards them, still rewards the ruthless and destroys the human. And the only way to escape it is to do what Mary did. Stop playing. Choose love. Choose obscurity. Choose survival over success. Because in the end, the Boleyns who reached for power all died horribly, and the one who walked away lived, quietly, peacefully, free. And maybe that's the real lesson. Maybe that's the real secret. Maybe that's what we're supposed to learn from their tragedy. Power isn't worth it. Not if the price is your humanity. Not if the cost is your family. Not if the sacrifice is your soul. Sometimes the smartest thing you can do is walk away. Be forgotten, be nobody, and live. Good night, sweet dreams. And remember, being forgotten isn't the worst thing that can happen to you. Being remembered as a monster is.